All right. We have arrived at round 5 of Interzonal 1962 in Stockholm. So Fischer managed to win round 3 and 4. So he's basically at this point before this game, he's at 3 out of 4. So he's picking up a little bit of steam. And in round 5 he's playing Istvan Bilek. And yeah, by the way, I'm Richard Persson, candidate master from Sweden. So I'm gonna put this on YouTube, trying to maybe record a couple of rounds this weekend. So we managed to complete this very long tournament at some point. Bilek is playing white, and why do we... Let's have a look here. Okay, this is the wrong game. This is the game. Bilek starts with 1 e4, and Fischer opts for Sicilian defense. So a very combative, how do you say, combative opening, I guess. White plays knight of 3. Fischer plays d6. So there is still a lot of options. It can become a dragon, it can become Najdorf, and nowadays very popular is to play the bishop b5 line as well, which is a little bit of a more positional line, but it wasn't popular these days in 1962, I guess. So Bilek continues with d4, Fischer takes, knight takes d4, knight of 6. So if you're playing Sicilian, I think knight of 6 is important to play early, because if you don't play this move, sometimes white has the option of playing c4, knight c3, and getting a lot of space in the center. But knight of 6 was played, and black continues with a6, the Najdorf opening. Very popular even these days. White goes for bishop g5. Fischer plays e6. And I mean, the Sicilian is a very wide opening. There is a lot of lines to learn. And for me, I like to simplify it a little bit to look at the pawn structure. And when I see those two pawns, I basically would call it a Scheveningen. I don't really know how to pronounce it. It's a Dutch opening, I think. So this Scheveningen setup, I mean, usually when you have these two pawns, one of the main lines of play for white is to play like g4 and g5. But because of this early development of the bishop, it's not really possible to do this in this line. I think usually in this more traditional Scheveningen structures, the bishop usually goes to e3, but in the Najdorf, you put the bishop on g5. So those lines are not really possible here. White goes for f4, and at this point we are heading straight for the poisoned pawn variation, which Fischer became kind of famous for, one of his signature openings. And during his career, I think he played this opening 11 times and he only lost 1 time. So that's quite a good record for Fischer. But when he played this game in 1962, it was actually the second time he played this poisoned pawn line with queen b6. So I see we have one viewer on Twitch. I'm gonna record this and also publish it on YouTube later, so it's gonna be on YouTube. I managed to publish 4 games from the first 4 rounds of Fischer in Stockholm 1962, so I'm gonna try to finish this. I started, I think, in 2018 with this video series, so it's been a while. Queen b6 was played, and this is the classical way to handle this line for white. You basically give up the pawn on b2, and white gets a lot of piece development, he gets a lot of activity, and black gets his extra pawn. So but Fischer, obviously, he has very good technique, so he managed to take the pawn, and very often in his Najdorf game he managed to keep the pawn and neutralize white's initiative. White played rook b1, attacking the queen, developing the rook on the b file. Black plays queen to a3. And at this point there is basically two moves, because white is a pawn down. He has very good development, and he basically needs to play either e5 or f5. I mean, those two are the main options to try to open up the game and convert this lead in development to some kind of kingside attack, probably. So in this game, Bilek opted to play e5, and black takes on e5. F takes e5, so now we have a little bit of a change in the pawn structure. So this pawn becomes isolated. If black managed to pick up this pawn, he will still have maybe these two pawns to shield his king, and that could be very dangerous. So it's a long-term risk for white to have this isolated pawn. Oh, one moment. Right, sorry about that. I'm not really editing the video, so unfortunately this is gonna be, I'm gonna keep this version. So we got f takes e5, knight goes to d7. I think there is an important choice here. I was watching the Master Game Database, and it's very popular here as well to play h6. After bishop h4, black plays g5, and at this point, after g5, the most common is to take on f6, g takes h4, and you get this kind of very imbalanced structure. According to Stockfish, this position is very equal, so it looks very strange, very imbalanced, but it's perfectly playable for black if you are confident to play a position like this, of course. But in Fischer's game, he opted for to play knight to d7, which is also a great move. Black puts the knight on the best square according to this structure in the center with this potentially very weak pawn on e5. So the knight is doing a good job from d7. It's an immobile, isolated pawn, so it can definitely become a target here. White continued with bishop to c4. Nowadays, I mean, this looks quite natural. You're creating different options for white, maybe to sacrifice a piece on e6. You could even give the knight and get the bishop on e6, but probably more interesting is to sacrifice the bishop and get this kind of position, immediately creating threats on c7. Sometimes you can take this pawn with a check. Nowadays, this line with bishop c4 is not that popular. The most popular choice today is to play knight e4. And the reason for this, I mean, in this game, Fischer played bishop e7, but It's maybe not the best move. A couple of years later, in Thüringer versus Fischer in 1965, Fischer decided to play 12 bishop e4, which is a much stronger option. And this is mainly the reason that bishop c4 a little bit fell out of popularity. And even Fischer basically fixed this line in a couple of years later. But in this game we see bishop e7. And the game continued with an immediate sacrifice of the bishop on e6. Basically, if white doesn't play very sharp, in the long run he's just going to be a pawn down and he's going to have a lot of problems, so he really needs to go for the attack. And this sacrifice is even more interesting at this point because black developed the bishop. There is maybe a little soft spot on g7 if the knight lands on e6. At this point Fischer makes a very solid choice. He doesn't take the piece, but he just castles. So in this way he gives back the pawn, but white has still this long-term weakness, so black secures his king a little bit and still have some targets in the position. So a very nice choice by Fischer to just castle. White also goes for short castle. We've got bishop takes g5, queen takes g5. At this point, if you look at white pawns on a2, c2, e5, they are all weak. They are targets. So even if there is material balance here, there is a lot of targets for black. And there is also this bishop is hanging, this knight is hanging. So I think it's looks like a very risky position for white mainly. Black continues to play h6. I think at this point e7 is a very interesting square for black. If he can return maybe at some point with the queen to e7, it could help to defend black's position. Even if white moves the queen, if you would play queen e7, maybe knight d5 could be dangerous. There are some very weak squares on the queen side. Also by playing h6, if white loses control over e5, that could be important for black. White plays queen h4, and black decides to pick up the loose knight on c3. Rook takes f7, rook takes f7. We got queen to d8 check. So let's see here. Knight f8 was played. Bishop takes f7. It looks very dangerous for black because basically when you take back here you got rook f1 check with tremendous pressure on the black king. This knight is going to fall, and you also have absolutely no development on the queen side, and your queen is like picking up some loose pieces, so it's really an unbalanced game. It could be very difficult to evaluate over the board if you haven't looked at these positions before. But if you're gonna play Najdorf or the poison pawn, you really need to prepare, and you have to know the details of this line to be able to play it. Otherwise it's gonna end pretty badly probably. So in this case, rook f1, Fischer plays king g6. Looks like a little bit of an odd choice, but white doesn't have a light squared bishop, so the king somehow it's kind of comfortable on g6. Rook takes f8. Bishop develops to d7, and the computer also suggests that you might be able to play queen e1 check if rook goes back, which is the only move. you could basically pick up this pawn with queen takes e5, and the point is that if white would take the bishop at that point, you can take this knight with a check. It's still not totally easy to evaluate because black doesn't have any development on the queen side, but computer seems to think that that line is maybe the best choice for black. In the game, Fischer played bishop to d7, and white decides to play knight f3 to prevent perhaps queen e1, and also open up some possibilities to bring in the knight to attack the black king. We got queen e3 check, and king f1 wouldn't be a good choice because of bishop b5 check, creating some, yeah, it's basically game over if that happens. So he needs to play king h1, and we got queen c1 check, knight g1. The knight becomes very passive here. I think it's very important for a white to try to bring this knight into the game. So at some point he would need to play h3, king h2 and bring the knight back. But he basically fails to do this. So queen takes c2, rook g8. Not totally easy to understand this move. And black plays queen f2. So I guess if white would try to play queen e7, you can bring the queen back. In that kind of case, I think it's just a matter of time before black is going to win. Maybe he's going to put the bishop on c6, protect the rook, and then get move the pawn and get the knight out and solve his development, basically. So we got rook f8, queen takes a2, just collecting some pawns. Rook f3, I'm not sure. Yeah, he wants to attack the queen maybe from this side. And black makes sure to secure the king with king h7. And black managed to win the game. Maybe it was a time scramble or something. I guess this kind of position takes a lot of time to play for white. And so black won, even though the computer seems to say that it's an equal position. I think in the end position there might be some ideas to maybe just keep the pawn on, keep the rook on a8 and then start marching this a pawn up the board. And if white cannot really create anything against black king, so that kind of easy plan would maybe be enough to win the game. So maybe this is why Bilek resigned, or he just ran out of time on the clock. I'm not really sure what happened there. So that's gonna be it for today. I might be back with a later, maybe I'm gonna do another game today if I have time, around 6 in Stockholm. So after this win, Fischer had 4 points out of 5, so he won 3 straight games and really picked